see that you posted something else.
Okay, we are live. Welcome to our weekly basic income discussion group. Today we are talking about the housing market. And before the discussion, we listened to a Planet Money podcast entitled Yes in My Backyard. And it talks about Sonia Traus and her story as a pro-housing, pro-development activist in the Bay Area. So the podcast itself does not reference basic income, but I know that at least I have some opinions about how basic income is related to the housing market. So I want to start by just going around and asking people what they think about the housing crisis and whether basic income, how basic income factors in for you in terms of maybe addressing it, or if we had a basic income, how it would impact the housing crisis.
Should we introduce ourselves again?
No need.
Okay.
Yeah, you can if you want. Go ahead, Betsy.
Okay. So I don't know a lot about the housing crisis and so on, but my intuition is that that there's plenty of land around, at least in the United States. And so what seems to be missing sometimes when prices are getting too high are enough places that are developed at the level that people like in terms of what people are looking for, which could be living close to a job, but could also be living close to being able to walk to cafes, or having people around that they can meet to date, or having parks, or whatever it is that make it unappealing to live in rural upstate North Dakota or something like that, where there's probably really cheap housing. So whatever is making the housing expensive in terms of the actual amenities and the features of the location seem like things that could be built up in a lot of other places. And so that seems like the most fundamental solution, is trying to make more areas be built up at a level that people enjoy. And perhaps not more than that, because it also can get to the point where it's really dense, and that's kind of unpleasant for people too. In terms of basic income, you and I have talked about this a bit, but I think a couple of things. So one, it at least could mean that fewer people are trying to live near particular jobs, so that might make it easier to build up other kinds of locations with the other kinds of amenities that people like. And obviously it affects, it's an income that, at least as you describe it, is independent of the cost of living where people are. So it would be it would decrease demand for expensive areas and increase demand for less expensive areas, all else being equal. So that would have an effect too.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I read this book, Bullshit Jobs, by David Graeber, and there was a line in there where he says, universal basic income might be a good idea, but you would have to have, you'd have to somehow have regulations to keep the landlords from just taking it all by raising the, they would just raise the rents suddenly. And I think it's, I don't know how economists make these kinds of, or do the analysis or make the predictions, but it does seem to me like that. It does seem like that might be something to worry about. But I'm interested in how to game it out.
Cool.
Yeah.
Alex.
I kind of before I got interested in the basic income stuff as much as I have now, I had been kind of following some of these discussions about affordable housing and the sort of YIMBY movement that sort of started, and I can see there's definitely a need. What seems clear to me is that there's certainly a need for more construction in cities. because just physically, like you said, people want to live in, potentially for all kinds of reasons live, and there's a limited amount of space, so you have to put people somewhere. To me, the question is, how do you do that? How do you build construction in such a way as that it doesn't automatically do the sort of gentrification problem? So it seems to me that, like, on one hand, it's very attractive to sort of say, well, we should just like open things up and let it, let the sort of free market sort it out. But I think, as they point out in sort of mentioned in passing in the podcast and also in that other piece, that can easily, because that's what's going to happen, is it's going to always be at the top end, typically, or where it happens. So
The new construction.
the new construction,
Like
yeah.
maybe luxury apartments.
Luxury condos are going to be the thing that, so I think, I don't know how this exactly connects to basic income, but it seems to me that, like Nick said, there's going to be an immediate problem is if you did supply it in a hot housing market like San Francisco or even now Boston, that it could easily be sort of gobbled up. So it seems to point to, at least in my head, to kind of like it has to be just one part of a number of different kind of solutions for housing, and housing is a really tough and tractable problem, and I think it seems to be, it's one of the things that kind of gets left out in a lot of these debates about we talk about, all kinds of other solving social sort of problems, but housing is like the kind of thing it's really tough because there's trade-offs, and it's really hard. So I don't know, I'd be interested to talk more about how basic income, I haven't really I'm trying to figure that out, how that could fit in, but it seems to me that like it's going to be, it isn't quite as neatly aligned as other issues are, with like sort of, there's a clear kind of thing like where everybody benefits, and in housing it's kind of like there are some zero-sum games. So I don't know where we go with that.
Cool. Richard.
Well, 2 years ago here in Boston, there was a ballot initiative that I believe passed. It was 10 or 20% of each new building that was constructed or something, apartment building, had to be affordable housing. So I'm not sure how exactly that worked out, but sounds like a good idea. And in Washington, D.C., there's a program where it's sort of basic income related, that is people who qualify get $7,000, and if they decrease their rents each year, and after 7 years they can withdraw up to $28,000 of that from the pool of money that if there's anything left over from decreasing their rents.
So if they haven't put it toward the rent, they can withdraw
Mm-hmm.
some amount of the rest.
Mhm.
Huh, that's interesting. Okay.
Say again. So how many you can put 20%?
Are you talking about the ballot initiative?
No. Well, I missed that. You said about how much you could put towards your.
$7,000 per year,
Okay.
and up to $28,000 over 7 years.
Right. Interesting.
And my mom was on a live stream, and she said,
nice.
if you have a basic income, you might not need a job, so don't need to be near it. But you would need to be near things like a hospital, grocery stores, etc. As Bethany says, being near stuff that counts is important for quality of life. Otherwise, you could easily live in a cabin. But the stuff you need to be near won't be there without people working, even if it's not you. I think that's right. And I think I agree with what Bethany said, that basic income gives people more freedom to live in more places, which is kind of what my mom is saying. And that can help take some of the pressure off housing prices. So if we only look at that effect, you would kind of expect, the housing market to crash in these really rich, really dense cities and prices to come way down.
But how do you-
people can just move away.
Like, is there a way to estimate how many people would take advantage of that?
Yeah, it's
Like, actually move away from Boston
Yeah, I
to
mean,
Springfield?
it depends on a lot of factors, not the least of which is how much basic income are we giving people.
Right.
And then how much basic income we give people will partly depend on how much positive effect we get. So it might partly depend on how people respond to changes in needing to be near the job market and stuff like that.
Right.
Right. It's a little.
I think-
Go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, I think one thing that's sometimes brought up, but is not often the main emphasis, is that the housing market and the labor market are very, very tightly linked to each other. People do need to live near where their jobs are. And Richard and I went to a Kennedy School forum a few weeks ago, where there was a guy there talking about how to fix the housing market, and basic income was brought up in the discussion, but he wasn't really talking about basic income in this context, but he was talking about how
Zoning.
he was talking about zoning and like you make it easier for people to develop housing, and then it's easier for people to live near where the jobs are, and the market can only be efficient if the labor is able to go where it needs to go, and then the whole housing thing and all these regulations were kind of getting in the way of labor mobility, of labor going to where it needs to go. So he was really emphasizing the connection between the housing market and the labor market, especially with respect to housing market restrictions. But he didn't mention kind of the connection with basic income there, which really changes where you need to go if you're a laborer, where you need to live. So I think that's a huge effect.
Yeah.
Do you think there could be a kind of counterbalancing effect? Like, are there some people who would say, "Oh, I always wanted to live near Harvard Square,
Right.
but I couldn't afford it before. But now with this basic income,
No, definitely.
maybe I can live there."
Yeah.
Right? I mean, there might be there, and maybe those would cancel each other out. I mean,
For sure. And also, if Harvard Square gets a lot cheaper too, then we're like, oh well, now I can afford it. Not only do I have the basic income, but also the rent is cheaper than it used to be.
So
Um,
you tend to be fairly confident that the net effect is going to be in the direction of evening out prices. Can you explain why it wouldn't counteract in the way that makes sense?
Yeah, I mean, it would a little bit. Like there'd be some people who follow that logic, but I think when you take the broad view, you have to think, okay, there are these areas that are really expensive, and there are some areas that are really cheap. And then as far as people go, there are some people who are indifferent between living in the cheap area or the really expensive area. Like the really expensive area is more expensive, but it's also got these other benefits. So there's some people who are kind of on the fence. Now you add a basic income into the mix. The basic income improves the quality of life more in the cheaper area than it does in the more expensive area because your money stretches further. So now we can imagine that in aggregate, you would expect there to be a greater incentive to move away from the more expensive areas to the cheaper areas. So that's kind of like the logic that I have in my head.
So I guess in that model, it sort of assumes that I think you mentioned something about that before, that like, Nashville, the rent is lower, but does it kind of assume that your salary is going to be lower in the same proportion or something? I mean, if you're
Right, your salary is going to be lower, but your basic income is not. It's going to be the same wherever you live.
right.
So
Is that true that salaries are lower and rents are lower?
I think so.
Nashville?
generally speaking,
New
or it
York
can be
has
part
a
of your
really
job.
high I bet if we did a correlation even of minimum wage in a city or in a state versus the cost of housing, would they track each other? And average wage and a whole bunch of other things. I would guess, but I haven't done that.
Right.
But I think you're right with the other part of what you said, where if you had a city like San Francisco where the housing is really expensive, and then you just gave everyone in San Francisco a basic income, then it's there's a good chance that it's just going to drive up prices of houses.
Right.
Now, I can also imagine an effect where maybe there are some people who have some money who kind of had no money before and they were kind of on the street. So maybe you can create some demand on the lower end of the prices. So that might create an opportunity for profit for developers there. So that might create an incentive to build cheaper housing even in San Francisco.
Right. Although the podcast kind of points out that what's limiting housing development in San Francisco is not demand for housing.
Well, it depends. So there are some. So you can think about the kind of slope of the demand curve. And if there are some people, if the prices are up here, and there are some people who can only afford what's down here, if there's more people who want to buy houses at this level down here, that's not really going to pull prices down. But if there's, more people who want to buy houses that are really expensive, then that might lead to more development, but it also is not really going to pull prices down. Whereas if you give people more incomes and boost them, that can flatten out the demand curve a little bit. And then it can start to become more profitable to produce more units that are slightly cheaper and that kind of thing. I mean, obviously there's a lot of other factors besides this, but you can imagine a world in which some people have money and some people don't have money, and you're building or you're making products for the people who have money, and you're not making any products for the people who don't have money. So if the people who have money suddenly have more money to spend because their jobs started paying more and stuff like that, then you'd expect prices to increase. But if instead of that, the people who didn't have money suddenly start to have money, then instead of prices increasing, you might start to see quantities increasing, more of those goods being produced, or finding ways to build more smaller housing units that have lower rent or something like that. Yeah. Go ahead, Richard.
There are things like shipping containers that they're converting into houses, and there's in places like Tokyo, there are capsule hotels, which are really tiny places that you can sleep for the night. And there's also 3D printing of houses that's starting to take off.
Yeah.
So that lowers construction costs, which means there could be more houses by the same developer.
Yeah. So all of this stuff, would be great. The problem is if the economy is such that it's more profitable to build a bigger luxury unit and you're actually going to make more money off doing that than building 4 smaller units, even if it's these cheaper methods, then they're going to build the bigger luxury unit. They're not going to build the 4 smaller units because those people are, even though the construction is cheap, the rent you're going to get is not, it's going to be that great.
To me, that points at that there's something about the housing market to some degree, or housing, I should say, not housing market, but just to talk about more broadly, that isn't going to be solved completely by market-driven solutions. In my head, that's one of the things that Matt Bruni points out is that this idea of social housing, where you basically build a large number of, I think the government's done that in the past, they can do it again, or you have these different alternative ways of ownership that aren't necessarily based on, a developer coming in and building things. And that may be a part of something that's not really, that goes beyond the basic income frame, but I don't know.
I just want to make sure I understand your problem. So the point is that you can more easily rent one unit at $5,000 than or one unit at $4,000 than 4 units of a quarter size at $1,000.
Exactly, that's right.
Yeah.
Yeah, if the income disparity is that big, if you've just got a really large population of poor people and then a decent sized population of rich people, and there's not someone in
filling out the
between
middle.
who can, yeah.
So why is that the case in San Francisco? It seems like you have some range.
There is some range. I'm just thinking from the perspective of a developer, or from the perspective of a landlord even, how do I make the most profit? And if there's profit to be made in dividing a single unit into 2 units and charging a little more than half the rent for the bigger unit, then I'm going to do that because I'm greedy. I want to make a profit.
Right.
So this is kind of, it's less a story of I'm seeing this in San Francisco. It's more a story of I'm thinking about it from the perspective of the developer.
But
or
it
the
seems
landlord.
like there are a lot of people crowded into apartments. That doesn't seem to. Maybe I'm misunderstanding, but people generally have roommates in Boston and in San Francisco, and you do have 3 or 4 people in relatively small apartments.
Yeah, I think that's right. So
They pack them even more than they did 20 years ago.
yeah,
Yeah.
There's basically places in Soma, South of Market, where they're kind of warehousing programmers, tech people now.
Right.
It's almost like warehousing. I'm over maybe exaggerating, but they're really, they're kind of they're really, what used to be they get paid pretty good salaries by national standards, but it's just so expensive that they just have to fit not quite mini hotels, but. And I think it's the last. I used to live in San Francisco, so it's definitely become really lopsided. There is a lot of the distribution of wealth is really there really isn't that middle
Yeah, okay, so you're saying that is the problem.
Yeah, so that could be part of the answer.
big
So
problem.
maybe the developers are developing these units, and then maybe occasionally there's a rich couple that moves in and has a unit to themselves. But then most of the time, it's like, I don't know, 8 people cramming themselves in there, and then that's still profitable for the landlord. So that could be the answer for why fewer units are being built, because you can kind of use a big unit as
Right.
a home for multiple people, that kind of thing.
Yeah.
So I know I have a lot of friends who, or I have at least some friends who say, the answer is just to build more and more and more. I don't know if that's the answer. I know, when they add, so I read somewhere, I forget where I read this, when they add lanes to a highway to kind of alleviate the traffic.
Reduce demand.
Yeah, it induces demand. So then, a couple years after they've added all the lanes, the traffic is just as bad as it was before, if not worse. And I can imagine that for a city like San Francisco too. You just build more houses. Now there's more room for people to move in, and maybe if all the cities in the world did this at exactly the same time and added capacity, then it could help. Like if you added lanes to every road in your city, then maybe that would help with traffic. But if you're adding lanes to just this one road, then people start using that road. If you add
Well, I
houses to one city,
Hold on,
yeah.
let me add a couple things.
Yeah, go
So,
ahead.
so one, like people can choose more easily not to drive or to drive than they can choose like not to be in a house or a house. So the induced demand might have to do with people not taking public transportation, not carpooling, and I'm not sure if that's analogous with housing completely.
Well, not living in another city. I think there are a lot of people who, choose not to live in San Francisco but would like to, or that kind of thing.
But then I guess the other thing I would say is like the U.S. It's like there's enough of a barrier to moving to another country that we can sort of think of the United States. If there was general capacity built in terms of where people like places being built where people wanted to live in the United States, it seems like that would be a decent answer. And I guess that's where I go back to like not just cramming people into already dense places, which seems like it's gonna just make everybody's quality of life kind of worse in some ways, but just making more of the cities like a bit more built up till they're at the point that people who would otherwise not want to move there, maybe they're like happy to move there now because there's enough things to do, enough people to meet, enough amenities. Just make more places the kinds of places people
Or
want
new
to
cities, or like expanding existing cities.
Yeah, exactly, right.
With the extra roads or whatever example, you typically have to like knock down houses or something like that to extend those. But there's articles now that have automated with automated cars that you could shrink the number of parking lots and decrease the number of size of roads, and you can create more green space like parks and
More housing.
Or more housing,
Yeah.
exactly, yeah. So that's
Yeah, that's
certainly a possibility. If we don't need giant parking structures, I don't think most people think giant parking structures are like beautiful landmarks in their city or whatever.
Right.
Maybe there's a special parking structure somewhere or something, but you replace a parking structure with more residential units. That's I don't think anyone's going to complain about that, or not very many people.
Yeah.
Maybe the few people who are still driving cars or something like that. Yeah.
I wonder if, like, at least, and this is again maybe get a little bit off the basic income topic, but it kind of could be related. Is that it seems to me that there's like a lot of, and it's not just US, but also global, that you have like these, like, even with the internet was supposed to be decentralizing. It's sort of ironically made more. It's more now attractive to go to like one of like, whereas like before you might get interesting jobs in like top 50 US cities. Now it's like, New York, San Francisco, Boston, and it's sort of concentrating those wealth and power in those places.
Yeah.
And so like sort of, I feel like that, I don't have a really good model for exactly how this might work, but it seems to me at some level that process is sort of like, to kind of undo that, you need like tools that go beyond just kind of like what we used up until recently in the last 20 years, like sort of, how like housing policy developed. And so I don't know, like basic income might be like you said, part of that. But like I think it's a really tough challenge that I don't know if we as a society really thought much about fixing. Like, how do you prevent? Like, how do you stop? Like, not stop, but how how do you alleviate at least the bad effects of that
I guess-
of that concentration of
What
wealth
I
and
keep
power?
trying to think about is like, why does everybody want to live in these places, and how much of that could be built like somewhere else, and how would you
Yeah.
do that, right? Because like, it doesn't. I can't pinpoint anything that isn't mostly a snowball effect. You know, for example,
Yeah.
Boston has bad weather or something. It's not like it's just like things that are part of the geography that you like can't change. There's things like waterfront views and stuff that are like that, but like in general, it just seems like you have this snowball effect of like building up culture in different places and jobs and so on. And
Yeah,
so people want to be
people
there.
want to go towards like-minded people, and I
Mhm,
think there's
exactly,
a
yeah.
great book called which I keep coming back to because I see the effects of it popping up a few years ago. It was actually about 10 years old now. It's called The Big Sort
Oh yeah,
by
I've
Bill
heard
Bishop.
that.
Do you guys know that one?
I've heard
Really
of it, yeah.
fascinating, and he basically did all the statistical analysis to show that, over since the 70s, people have basically just kind of like, we've just sorted ourselves in these kind of,
Right.
and you see it reflected in politics. So it's kind of like what you're getting at. I don't know
Yeah,
how
yeah.
you can.
But it seems to me like even if people are self-assorting, there's no reason the geographical area couldn't be bigger, or there couldn't be more cities that
Yeah.
they want to sort to. So it's kind of like, I wonder I mean, I think some of this is already happening. Like you see different cities become places people want to go more and more, like in Colorado or Portland or Seattle. You know,
Yeah.
it happens. It just happens kind of slowly.
Yeah.
So I don't know what kind of policies would sort of speed it up.
Right, and they said something in the podcast about somebody did an estimate that San Francisco could have grown twice
Yeah,
as
that was
fast or
interesting,
something.
right?
Yeah.
Like the economy could have grown twice as fast
Right.
if it weren't for these limits. But if it had, maybe Portland and these other places wouldn't be
Right.
growing and getting more interesting. I mean, maybe
Right.
even though it's it's not pleasant when you're living through it, maybe it's actually better than some of the alternatives.
Mm.
Like if there was some like magical technology that could dig really deep skyscrapers into the ground and like with super fast elevators, like if this weren't an issue,
Right.
then maybe like we'd have just one big city, right? Like everyone would have moved to New York by now, except the
Right.
corn farmers.
I think it seems like there's some cost to being like too dense for some people. Like New York is too dense for some people, and some people really want to be in a place that dense and stuff like that. So it seems like there would be some sort of preference that would drive some people out to where they can have more space.
But that doesn't mean that you can't live around the edges of New York City,
Right.
slightly less dense areas, and still have one central hub.
Well, but it's just going to be still pretty dense until you're pretty far away. I mean, you could have one center hub, but that seems unnatural. It seems to make more sense for people's preferences to have like smaller hubs, like because otherwise then you're choosing between super dense or you're really far from any hub. And why have a choice
I'm
like
thinking
that?
about that article
Seems
we
bad.
read for the climate meetup when we talked about climate and the environment, and he was talking about splitting New York City into
Oh,
5
yeah.
cities and having like different so you'd have like the main hub, but then there'd be like
Right.
satellite hubs in the various boroughs, and like
Sure, yeah. There's a little bit of that in
I
it.
can imagine. So I think we can still get like people wanting to live in like a hub that's not like the biggest hub ever. I still think we can kind of cram that into a pretty small geographical area, hypothetically.
Right, but I just see no reason for it all to be around one mega hub.
In terms of the impact on the environment,
I guess
like
it's a little
we're
more
leaving most
efficient.
of the planet alone if we all live in one place. I mean, that's my thought. Richard, do you have something?
Well, they're in North Dakota. They're converting old missile silos into condos, and since they're underground, they're creating artificial windows like big screen TVs, so they can pretend that you're looking outside.
Oh,
And then, like in the Resident Evil movie,
I was
there's the
gonna
hive. They create they fool all the scientists into thinking that they're looking outdoors, and they're really not.
Right.
so weird.
Yeah, it's a giant underground
Research facility.
research facility. Yeah, that has fake windows.
It's like a matrix, but not they're not plugged into it.
Right.
And they never go outside, the scientists? Like, don't they ever try to leave?
They can. Yeah, I don't know how often they go outside. I think they live in there.
Mhm.
Yeah, and then they all turn into zombies, and the rest is history.
Yeah, I always see another thing from is that your
This is my mom. Yeah.
Like,
Good
So
point.
she says it's not random regarding which cities attract people to live in them. In Boston, the colleges are a big draw. In New York City, the financial sector. San Francisco, the tech sector, etc.
Yeah.
I think that's right. And I think what Bethany said is right too. That we build up all this stuff in various kind of hubs, and then there's kind of a feedback or a snowball effect that builds on itself. So you've got good colleges, now you have good restaurants. You have good other stuff. You have good entertainment. And it just
Right.
good jobs, and it all kind of it's
Not
all kind of-
true.
Your mom said scientists don't need to go outside.
Yeah. Depends what kind of scientist you are, I guess. If you're a
Yeah.
naturologist.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
That's funny.
But So then a question we might ask is how do we spark this effect? And I don't think the answer is
Yeah.
if we build houses, then suddenly people will move to all the houses. So I don't think
Spark which effect?
the snowball effect of you've got a city that's got all these different great things that people like that kind of depend on each other.
Right.
Well, if
So
you were to like boot that up for
how do you
new
bootstrap
city.
a city?
Yeah.
from
So that you
scratch.
have more, like, basically, you decrease demand for San Francisco because you've also got a tech hub in Seattle. I mean, that's like some of this is basically already happening. I think,
They tried to in Australia.
Yeah.
I remember when I was growing up and sort of in my sort of teens and 20s, there was a lot of talk about they were going to build something like this. It was called the Multifunction Polis, MFP, and it was a big deal. And they had a site and they had it all ready to go, and then it all just kind of fizzled. And I don't know what ended up happening to that, but they really, the government was really keen to build something like that. And it was like, I feel like there was an era when people were talking about doing that. You don't really hear that happening now.
Brazil's capital, Brasilia, is
Brasilia.
a similarly designed city, and
Interesting.
it exists as a city. It's not successful in the way they wanted it to be, though.
But that, I wonder if that's because that might suggest that it's hard to do this like top down because it's just like so complex to try to figure out all the things that end up organically arising that people really like.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So my hunch is that cities did emerge, like they
Right.
came out of somewhere, and so there are factors that facilitate the emergence of new
Right.
cities or the building up of existing towns into cities and stuff like that.
Yeah.
And I think without having to answer the question of what specific things a city needs in order to start accelerating in growth, we can know how to facilitate that by giving people more freedom of where to live,
Right.
right? So I think that's a big part of what basic income gets
Yeah.
us. So I want to try playing a clip from the podcast. So we're going to see if this works.
Okay.
No, it does not work. Why don't you say
I was gonna say part of the conversation we haven't really talked about thus far is we're sort of talking about how people making choices to live as if we're kind of like rational actors that can sort of like make a list, and for a lot of, and that may be true for probably a lot of people in this room and for a lot of people sort of in the upper middle class and everything, but a lot of the real problem with gentrification is that we deal with people who just there's no really they don't have a choice.
Right. That was actually
really-
the next comment I was going to make.
Yeah.
It's like one thing that like helps the problem solve itself is if people have the capacity to move, which takes like startup funds and stuff like you have to have some money to move.
You have
right?
the cultural and
Yeah.
capital and some economic capital
Yeah,
to start that process. so.
exactly. So you can't really take the pressure off the housing demand in the same way otherwise.
And maybe
Yeah.
basic income could be part of that.
Right,
process.
right. At least
Yeah.
for the financial sort of part of it. And I mean, another thing that maybe helps with that is if instead of thinking of it as like moving to a faraway city, you're kind of expanding the city a bit or like making a new hub that's pretty close. So like you're not trying to move to a totally faraway place that has not near any of your friends or family.
Right,
For like
right.
the social capital.
Yeah, see, that's
part.
another thing that I always
Yeah.
find whenever I've heard sort of, there's always this discussion about like, I can't afford to live in my job. As people say, well, just go and live in a cheaper city, and
Right.
that's talking about ripping people out of their their network of relations, and that's
Right.
like that's sort of
Yeah. So there's
Yeah, I
a
think
ton
that's
of
really
reasons why
tricky.
people want to stay where they are.
yeah.
But there are also people who don't necessarily need to stay where they are, except that they can't leave. They don't-
Right.
Yeah.
And that's what that.
So that's what this is about to be about.
Yeah.
I think this is going to work this time.
And so I was reading the paper about people who were displaced because they couldn't afford to stay. And I was like, this place is terrible. You can't afford to stay. And if you want to leave, you can't afford to leave because you can't save up any money because moving costs. So it just felt so grim.
Yeah, I remember that part.
Yeah. So, I mean, I think, she doesn't have the money to leave. So I think for someone like Sonia Traus, this is Sonia Traus, for someone like her, if she had had a basic income, she would have had the money to leave. Like,
She had the money to leave. Wasn't she talking about other people?
um,
She did move. Or she changed jobs.
okay, for the people she's talking about.
Yeah. Anyway,
At
sorry,
least,
that was
yeah.
a side point. But
For the people she's talking about, if there is someone who wants to leave but can't afford the moving costs, then basic income is a way out, and it doesn't just pay your moving costs. It also means you have an income wherever you go.
right. So then, like you don't maybe have to put up as much money up front and stuff like that. Because
Right.
landlords might not be as worried about it, like
Like-
if you have a basic income.
Exactly, and earlier she was talking about calculating her real wage. Like she made $20 an hour in Marin, but
Yeah, that was interesting.
she realized that due to her commuting costs, she was really only making $12.50 an hour. So she quit her job and started a job at a bakery near her house, making $12.50 an hour.
Yeah.
You can make the same kinds of calculations.
Oh, she did say she wanted to move, but couldn't afford to. Sorry.
Yeah.
I guess so.
She wanted to move, but she couldn't even afford to move. So you can make the same kinds of calculations with the basic income. Now, your bottom isn't zero. Your bottom is whatever the basic income is.
Right.
So this issue is not brought up really that much later in the podcast, but I wanted to point it out here just because it's really something where you can see like the effect of basic income would be pretty substantial.
Yeah.
Yeah, and it gives you more flexibility if you're between things or you want to go through a career change or you're like want to
Right.
downscale or something like that, then you wouldn't have to, it wouldn't be an all or nothing thing.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. I mean, it seems to me like it's the people on the low end of the income bracket that would move away from expensive places the fastest with a basic income. And maybe I'm underestimating some things like the social factors, but it just seems like the price differentials across the United States are so big that if the basic income was most of your income, like your quality of life would change so much. Living somewhere where rent was like $250 instead of like $2,000.
Yeah. Go ahead, Richard.
There are also public transportation considerations.
That's true. Yeah.
Like when I was living in New London, Connecticut, outside of it, you couldn't really go into the public transportation was so awful. You couldn't really go anywhere, and they didn't start until like 10 a.m. So you couldn't really have a job. So it's just dumb.
So I guess that's another thing in terms of like what attracts people to a place we're talking about is like a public transportation.
Yeah. And something like Uber, which costs a bit more than public transportation, but is a lot more flexible. If you have a basic income, maybe you can afford to Uber around every once in a while, and it gives you a lot more not just freedom to spend money, but freedom to go places and freedom to move around.
Well, that reminds me also, like, I guess part of what would happen to housing depends on what would happen to the job market with the basic income.
Yep.
Because, like, if you don't have to go regularly, like every day back and forth, your transportation needs, for example, are lighter. And if you, in general, like, I wonder how much of what attracts people to these different cities is the jobs versus all the other attractive things about them. And your mom was bringing that up too with like the different sectors that are in the different places.
Yeah. So when people say you just can't live in the city without a car, a lot of times what they're saying is they're assuming that you need a job and you've got to commute to your job, and they're assuming that you got to drive to the grocery store and buy your groceries. If you don't need a job and you can Uber around, on whatever nights you want to go places and work days, and you can order your groceries, on Amazon Fresh or whatever, like that, maybe the same place, you don't need a car if you have a basic income, that kind of thing. Go ahead.
Yeah, and also, all the democratic socialists and things, it looks like a job guarantee is highly likely, so that might push down all the need for all the, if there are people, at the forum, they said that the people are going to earn like $36,000, and that might, eliminate the startups and things like that because they can't afford to pay $36,000 and they can't afford life insurance not life insurance, health insurance. But well, Democratic Socialists, they want to have universal health care, so that would decrease the amount of the demands. But if you're going to have such high wages, you're going to eliminate a lot of jobs to begin with. So that's another need. That's why some people want a basic income and a job guarantee at the same time.
Yeah, jobs guarantee is really tricky, and you know there are a lot of issues that I have with it, and one of them is, do we really want to be making up work for people to do as an excuse to give them money? And I feel like you're taking away people's freedom as a way to, you know, have a reason for paying them, and that really feels kind of backwards to me. And obviously, if you have a jobs guarantee, you know, now everyone still has to commute to their jobs. So some of the environmental emissions benefits of a basic income kind of go away because, you know, maybe as Richard is saying, you know, all these other jobs might disappear because they can't compete with the guaranteed jobs. But everyone's still going to have a job, and you know, you're going to have all the negative effects of that along with it.
Well, maybe those jobs wouldn't be necessarily the traditional kind of jobs that would require commuting. I'm not arguing either way. I'm just sort of thinking out loud here, like maybe but I take the
shoveling
point.
snow for old ladies or something.
Yeah, well, the sort of then issue gets shades into community service then, and how do you should you incentivize that? Should it be like something you give of your own? You know, and that's the tricky question. I don't have to feel for the right thing. My intuition is kind of like yours, which is kind of like, the sort of creating jobs for the sake of it does seem a little, but maybe there's something about it that I'm not, that there's a kernel of the idea in there that's worth pursuing.
Well, I like to separate, you know, there are kind of two things we expect from the labor market. One is that it provides workers with money, and then the other is that it allocates labor efficiently. So certainly, I can sympathize with people who say, well, we want to incentivize people to do more community service, et cetera, et cetera. And I would say, okay, then let's pay for that and let's do what's needed if you convince me that this is what's necessary. But that's different from saying we need a way to get people money and let's post hoc come up with an excuse for why they're doing work that's worth paying for or something like that. That feels backwards to me.
Back to the housing thing a little bit, sort of the flip side of people having more jobs but having less again. I was thinking about how many people move when they retire, which suggests that, like, even including the fact that people like to stay near their family or like to live in certain places, like you see a lot of people feeling like they can move somewhere else.
Right?
Yeah. When you actually don't have to be near a job, that's a big time at which people move on average. You know, so that just suggests that you might see a lot of movement if people weren't tied to a particular location for their job. I think they might shuffle around, presumably based on and retiring. You actually usually have less income, not more. You know. So, but anyway, if you had also the income effect you were talking about, plus fewer people tied to your job.
My intuition is if we had less need to build society around jobs, period. Like however you define them, then a lot of other things that we take for granted will sort of, find a new space in that new world somehow. And I don't think we can predict in advance what that's going to be like, but to me it seems like that is going to be probably somewhat inevitable, just given the fact that the notion of job creation in the traditional sense of like a long-term job in a company that you stay in for 20 years and you get benefits and the gold watch they're not creating more of those in general. I don't know, but you guys maybe study more about the labor market than I do, but that's my intuition. So I feel like if we can get away from that idea of like we have to build things around, like as you said, like our cities, we're building our cities around, like we need to have people get to a job. So will we need as much of that in the future? Probably not.
Right.
But I don't know. I'm not sure. I mean, I think in a future where you're changing jobs every month, it's even more important that you live near where the jobs are, right? Because you're going to be searching for a job often.
If by that you mean like a piece of work as opposed to like a sort of full-time job,
The gig economy.
yeah, the gig economy, right? That's certainly true. That's very true for me in my personal situation. You know, I have a small company. We're in Boston because
Yeah.
there's a lot of kinds of work we can do. But I would, in a world we had a basic income, it would be good not to do some of that, but not be spending all your time hustling. Say, that would be nicer to do less of
Right.
the hustling and.
Yeah. And I think this raises the question of when we say job, what do we mean? So there's always ways for you to spend your time, doing something that might be interesting to you. And if that's our definition of job, then wherever you go, there's an unlimited number of jobs, right? If it's this kind of contractual thing with an employer where you're getting paid a certain minimum amount and you have to work a certain minimum amount of time every week, that's kind of what we think of as a job in today's society. But if we have a basic income, then when you talk about living near where the jobs are, what is even a job at that point once you have that? Yeah.
That's kind of what I'm thinking too.
Yeah.
I'm thinking, I don't know, like the terminology is weird because it's like we're conditioned by the language we use, right? So I'm always like, do I have a job in the traditional sense? No, but do I work? Yes.
Right.
So, and we all do different kinds of work, whether or not it's defined by this little box called a job.
Right.
I also, go ahead.
No.
Independent even of people having more or fewer jobs, there's also a lot of technology that's enabling people not to have to work on site, which also gives people the flexibility to not have to commute and to live in different places.
Yeah.
And I presume that could put take some pressure. That's probably already taking a little pressure off the housing market.
But at the same time, for all that's happening, we
Right.
are having these like crazy housing
Yeah.
price spikes in the hub places.
Right.
Yeah.
And I guess I wonder, if you looked at the historical data, presumably the people calling it a crisis are already doing this, but is this just what happens where you have the snowball effect, a city gets really in demand, it gets so high priced that everyone's like, okay, screw this, and then some other city emerges, then other cities get built up and people move out? Or is this
It could be
not,
are we
just in the middle of sort of an organic process?
where it buds like a certain size and it kind of buds off like a cell.
Right.
Yeah.
Something like that. Because it seems like at a certain point, you're thinking okay, should I really live in New York or San Francisco, or should I live in Seattle or something? And it's just so expensive in San Francisco that you move to Seattle.
I never thought about it this way before this discussion, but I do think I'm going back to the thought I was having about how there are these kind of winner take all, rich get richer
Right.
feedbacks that lead to the distribution of city sizes and drive the creation of really huge cities. And
Exactly.
if it weren't for the fact that the city that was going to really win that once and for all gets too expensive for some people, that's what limits it.
Yeah, exactly. I think so. Right. Yeah.
Continue.
Well, I don't know. This is related to what Bethany was saying, and it's been kind of on my mind. I first, it was, I don't know how many years ago it was, but I remember really clearly that in the same, it was probably like the same issue of the New Yorker or something, but there was a bunch of hype about virtual reality, and I was exposed to the idea of universal basic income, and I was like, oh, great. Obviously, people are going to build giant hives out in
Nevada,
currently unused land, and be like, okay, virtual reality junkies, come just sign over your basic income and welcome to your new pod. Your Soylent shakes will be delivered every 4 hours. Which obviously is a very kind of dystopian way of describing it, but I don't know. I do think there's I was trying to reformulate that into a kind of a thought experiment. Is there some threshold of universal basic income, for example, that makes it economical for a developer to develop, find where it's cheapest to do.
Like a new thing, a new
Like,
city or
for people who have some kind of interest, like playing video games or whatever, and they want to move someplace specifically because it'll be cheap enough for them not to have any other income,
Right.
and they're willing to sacrifice, being near the beach or whatever it is.
a new utopian community almost, like a
Right, but I mean
like
that-
intentional community, but on a large scale.
Yeah, but that right, and maybe it doesn't have to be that large, right? I mean, but it seems like it still costs money to build
Right.
even like a bunch of
Right.
little cells for video gamers.
But the materials costs are going down, like Richard was saying, right? Like you can build some pretty cheap housing now, probably.
Right. I guess
It would
maybe
pay
maybe if
itself
that was a
off.
threshold. I mean,
Yeah.
it would be hard to turn that into a threshold because it would depend. Like, okay, how monk-like are we really going to assume these
Right.
people are
Right,
going to
and
live?
it can also be a continuum. Like maybe instead of building, this hive in the middle of the desert, you go to Detroit, which already, like it's kind of a depressed city, but it's already a city and it's got some infrastructure in place. And you build some housing there, and
Right.
maybe people can rely on that and use some of their basic income to pay rent, and you can kind of kickstart the city or jumpstart it. Yeah.
Right.
There's also like the whole libertarian seasteading thing where they build this city out in the 100 miles outside of the U.S. or
the
something.
platform,
So they have
the oil
international
platform
waters.
off the coast of California, right?
There's also they're actually planning on building one in the Sea of Honduras or something like that. Where they have an agreement with the countries around it, where they have to use local labor to construct it, but they get to have all their do pretty much whatever they want there. And there's also this cruise ships where they can off of California, where they can have people who aren't legally allowed to go into the U.S. to just have tech communities or something like that there.
Huh. Interesting.
Yeah, so there are a lot of possibilities. I worry about them getting hit by a hurricane and also having no law.
I was wondering about that. Like, what if somebody murders someone else? Do they have any police? Like,
They probably have come up with their own, right? Their own.
Libertarians are a funny bunch.
I mean, they're probably wealthy enough that they're unlikely to murder each other.
You
So I
guys,
don't know.
you
We'll
guys
see.
watch
I'll
the-
be interested to see how it goes. Yeah.
that episode of Silicon Valley where
Yeah, I was just thinking about that. He drives into a like a shipping container, right?
Oh no.
One of the characters is taken by you explain.
no, but you guys should watch it.
You should
It's
see
very,
it.
it's
It's
very,
funny.
It's very, very
Very
funny.
funny.
I thought it was-
So let's play another clip. This is related to some stuff we already talked about.
It's what the whole city needs.
We have a housing shortage. The way you fix a shortage, build more housing. So simple.
So I think we've kind of established here that it's not quite that simple. You add more lanes to the highway, more people can drive to the highway. You build more housing in San Francisco. It's unclear that that's going to be the answer to the question.
You may end up creating a lot more luxury condos.
You may end up creating a lot more luxury condos, and the people who say build more housing would say, okay, well that's because that's the market rate for housing right now, and you keep building at the market rate until the market rate goes down. And hypothetically, you could, there could be some number. If you build 7 billion luxury housing units in San Francisco, and there's room for everyone in the world to live in San Francisco, then some of those developers who thought they were building luxury condos are going to be disappointed.
And eventually they're going to start building cheaper
Right.
ones.
Well, the cost of those.
Or they'll just lose money on the ones they already built and start running them for cheap.
But it's like a trickle down housing construction model, right?
Well, I think
Yeah.
maybe what you're saying, Alex, is that you might have to build. I mean, to do it for this logic to apply, you might have to build a lot of units, like way more than
So
is kind of practical.
yeah, or what you could say is everyone who lives in San Francisco is a resident of San Francisco, and nobody else is ever allowed to move to San Francisco. Now,
Right.
if we build housing in San Francisco at the market rate, that'll probably help the prices come down.
Right.
But San Francisco isn't like an isolated market, and
Right,
none of these
right.
really
Right.
expensive housing markets are isolated markets.
Yeah.
Yeah, but I do feel like
Yeah, that's a good.
And then a good point that I think your mom just brought up about
Yeah.
the Amazon's new locations. I thought that might come up too, because I feel like
Oh,
that's
yeah.
another
Oh yeah.
interesting development that's now like corporations are now kind of like, speculating about whether that's going to change that housing market.
Right.
Right.
kind of
Was anyone
dynamics.
here was any part of them a little disappointed that it wasn't Boston?
Oh,
Yeah.
it was in Boston. I didn't even find out.
I mean, yeah, it was.
I
Where did
wasn't
they choose?
disappointed.
Northern Virginia and New York City. They did 2 of them.
They're doing one in New York City.
Yeah, believe it or not.
What?
I bet.
And it turns out, I mean,
It's okay. I've heard the New York housing market hasn't been doing so great lately, so maybe this will help. Go ahead.
I think there's some kind of scam going on. Like,
I think they knew exactly where they were going to go, and this was all a bid to get as much data from the cities
data and money
incentives. Yeah,
But also, where they're building it in New York City has been, I don't know,
Long Island City, right?
some recent regulation has all these government incentives if you do something in like a distressed area or something. And this one is one of those.
And you
special
build Jeff
zones.
Bezos a helipad.
Is that part of it? Yes, that would help.
So he can heli in to the place. Seems fun.
He's not going to be taking the 7 train.
Yeah, he doesn't have time for that 7.
I bet.
Nobody's
I
talking
bet.
seven train.
I bet it goes way beyond that. I mean,
Wait, so the other one is Northern Virginia?
Yeah, where your sister is.
like Washington D.C.
Oh,
Yeah.
also close to where there's already a lot of high cost housing. Okay, so it's not really going to help any place revitalize, I guess.
No,
The
they
guarantee-
didn't build in Detroit.
Yeah, and
Uh-huh.
it's like the deal or the projections or he's
Yeah.
guaranteeing to create like 50,000 jobs at
Wow.
average salary of 150,000 or something.
Right,
Like it's
right.
But most of those people won't be the people that are displaced. They won't be giving jobs. I mean, there'll be probably some effect, local effect from the economy on that, but I suspect there'll be more displacement than there will
for
be.
sure. I mean, just
you
the
know.
fact that the average salary is gonna be 150,000. That
Yeah.
tells you it's not like
You're not just
Mostly
getting
the-
people off the street.
Right.
Right.
Northern Virginia. Yeah.
Yeah, but I
Um,
mean, it's interesting because it's part of this snowballing effect. Because I guess Amazon really wants to be in a place where there's already a lot of qualified employees that are easy to hire, and so it's like one of these things where it's like you might
Rich
think
get
it would be
richer.
good for social aggregate to like help spread out the population from the housing perspective, but like from Amazon's perspective, they want to view where all the people already are, and so it only increases the density
Right.
or the housing costs in that
And the
area, right?
infrastructure and everything.
Yeah, I mean,
They can piggyback on it.
everything's already there, so then that's
And
where
it
you
sort of
wanna
goes
be.
back to what I was saying before about
Right.
the sort of like the global city phenomena. We get concentration of, and then corporations are kind of like moving their headquarters around these kind of few locations and kind
Right.
of just basically leaving the rest of the country
Right.
in the dust.
Yeah.
Right. So I guess it's back to that question of like, how do you get the snowball happening in other places?
Yeah, and I mean,
Yeah.
I think the answer to that question is basic income. So-
What? Basic.
Yeah, so I mean, back to this quote. I mean, she says the way you fix a shortage, build more housing. So simple. I think the way you can fix this kind of shortage is create more areas that are desirable to live in.
Yeah, that's what I was trying to say.
Yeah. So that's
so reduce the demand, right? I mean,
Right. Exactly.
reduce the demand,
Yeah.
increase the appeal of living somewhere where you don't necessarily need to be near that higher paying job.
Right.
Like basic income, it makes it viable to live in a variety of more different places. In addition to making it easier to afford to move, because you can pay your moving costs, it also means that the places you move to, you now have more options.
Right.
So I think, and that doesn't have to be the middle of the desert. It can be moving to a city that is already a city, but maybe wouldn't have the kind of job you would have needed to support yourself if you had moved there without a basic income. That kind of
this
thing.
could also help solve the minority rule problem in the Senate.
So what?
Minority rule.
Same.
Oh, right, where you have
Oh.
like a lot of small states that have disproportionate amount of power. Like
Oh,
with
Yeah,
Right,
you only
right.
need like a few tens of thousands of people to move to Wyoming
Right.
who have just like
Right.
nationwide average voting patterns.
Right. That's interesting. I hadn't thought about that.
Yeah. I mean, I think, I don't know if it'll necessarily solve that problem because I think people are still going to tend to want to live in cities, and there are plenty of kind of cheaper cities out there.
Right.
But
Even
somebody's
a
gonna want to
small-
live in
And
Wyoming.
none of them are in Wyoming.
But maybe a small effect could.
None of them are in
It
Wyoming.
made
But hold on. But if you want to literally take your $1,000 a month or whatever it ends up being and have it go as far as possible, somebody's gonna want to go to Wyoming that wouldn't want to go to Wyoming otherwise. Because
Yeah,
like that's where it's really cheap.
but there are going to be people who want to leave Wyoming too, and I think there are going to be more of those people because they're like, oh, now I can afford to live in some city.
But
somewhere.
even a small,
Yeah.
I mean, even a small shift could still add up over time.
Yeah.
Like that's one possibility.
Yeah. Why doesn't it still follow your like net moving to the cheaper places rule?
It's not just moving to the cheaper places. Like the cheapest place is, in terms of housing prices, is Antarctica or the middle of the desert or something like that.
Right.
So people are going to move to places that have infrastructure, that have, a lot of them are still going to want jobs, but maybe they can afford a lower paying job or something like that. It's not just about moving to the place where you don't have to pay any taxes or pay any rent or something like that.
It seems to me to make that work to some degree, you're going to need some level of, initial government infrastructure to get the ball
Right.
rolling on all those things.
Yeah.
I can't see it just happening completely driven by like just purely market forces, and basic
Yeah.
income. It would be sort of part of a series of things about rethinking how we.
It's also
Great
kind of
cities.
I don't know if network effect is the right word, but if you could somehow get a lot of people to like expect other people to move there at the same time and thus move there themselves, right? Because you don't want to live someplace that's too
You
sparsely
don't know
populated.
anyone.
Yeah.
I'll get to you in a second, Richard, but I just want to say that.
Yeah.
What's
Oh,
what she was
yeah.
saying? Like, well, in the, let's see, about 400 years ago, they had these, in Germany, they had these people signing up people over all the different cities and having them all move at once to the, to Eastern Europe and things like that.
Oh, interesting. Huh.
And they also had it in the Eastern U.S. going out west. They had
Alright.
signed up people to go move all at the same time.
That's a good point. Oh yeah, settling the West is kind of an interesting example of settling new areas and stuff.
I mean, these are problems we may have to really face with climate change too.
Right.
And
Oh yeah, good point.
Yeah. And
Yeah.
I think what Alex said is right, that there needs to be like some kind of kernel to build around of maybe government or something already in place. But I also think, we have plenty of cities. We have plenty of cities that are cheap to live in. And so we have plenty of kernels. We don't, for Nick's thing of having like complex in the middle of the desert where everyone goes, and plays virtual reality, that's kind of a from scratch thing. And it's not out of the question, but we don't necessarily need that to solve the housing
It's
crisis.
cheaper to do it in Detroit. Or,
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Where there's already infrastructure. And maybe for this particular thing, if the basic income is high enough and you can get enough people to move to this VR complex or something like that, maybe it does become more profitable to build it in the middle of nowhere. But there's
Right, but at a certain point in the middle of nowhere it becomes more expensive because then you have to really start from scratch for the
Yeah.
utilities.
exactly. That's kind of like
Yeah.
where we are now.
Well, and then Detroit, I think I was reading that it's undergoing a sort of process of de-development. Some of the inner city parts, like they've actually knocked down whole blocks and created like these gardens and these parks and stuff like that. So that actually, at some level, that actually might start being attractive for a certain kind of
Right.
people to move there as well.
Actually, if you could build like skyscraper apartment buildings, and there's in like Chicago, there's a trend where they're building parks on top of their skyscrapers, and
Yeah.
that actually reduces the heating costs and things like that. And there's also a trend where they're trying to build parks underground, where it has these like mirrors that reflect the sunlight.
That's really interesting. Oh my god. Huh. That's cool.
And so those could be attractive to people as well.
Yeah. Yeah, another thing that we haven't really talked about is like what would the impact of basic income be on crime rates, and like how would that affect the number of areas where people were like reasonably happy to live?
Yeah.
Because so one of the sort of deal breakers is if you have a high crime rate, then as soon as people can not be there, they want to not be there, right? So then that's not really available as like desirable housing area.
Yeah.
In I think it was Ghana, they had a basic income program, and they actually increased coastal cohesion because people were expecting people to be like beggars, but if they had basic income, they didn't want. They actually weren't expecting people to ask for money, so they were more welcome to socialize with them, and people were able to be more self-employed, and so that actually decrease the crime rate because people were had money, and so they didn't need to go and steal or.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Have you-
We were just talking about like the impact on crime that basic income could have, and how that might affect like where people want to live or how many desirable
Oh yeah,
areas
that
there
could be a
are.
major. Have you done a basic income meetup on that subject?
On crime, we haven't
Yeah,
yet
we haven't.
actually. Yeah, that would be an
That's
interesting one. Yeah,
Yeah, it's a good one.
that's a good one.
Yeah, and I think I think that's right. I think if people aren't desperate, they're less likely to commit crimes. And if if I as a person am deciding where to live, I feel a lot safer moving to a place where the people around me aren't desperate.
Right.
So if there's basic income, then that's everywhere.
Right.
So it's
Right.
it's not just about this place is cheaper and depressed and my money's going to go further there. It's also that now that we have a basic income, there's some of the other downsides of living in this area are now gone or lessened.
Right. I guess that's part of what I was thinking about when we brought up like Detroit, for example.
Yeah.
Like people could more easily move there if they weren't so worried about the crime. I don't know if there's still
Yeah.
crime in Detroit, but there was.
There's still some crime in Detroit. Yeah. I mean, but there's crime everywhere.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But it's one of the things that drives housing costs up in other places. I guess I'm thinking too.
Because people want
Because they want to
to
be
safer
away from the
neighborhoods,
crime.
yeah.
Yeah, exactly. So.
I was reading a while ago that in Detroit there's these people who are buying up all the foreclosed houses and fixing up the nicer ones and just tearing down the other ones to build more expensive houses and things like that.
Oh, in Detroit?
Mhm.
What's driving the demand for the more expensive houses? Do you know?
Like they're planning for people to actually want to move there in the future.
Oh, okay, cool.
Yeah, I mean, an important aspect of the housing market is the speculative aspect.
Right.
So
Right.
people aren't just buying houses to live in; they're buying, they want to buy a house, at a reasonable price, and then, with the idea that if they ever wanted to move, they could sell it at a higher price. And there are other people who aren't even thinking about living there who just want to use this effect to turn a profit, flip a house.
And
Yeah.
it seems to me that the increasing presence of that speculative market, especially in these global cities, now you get like people coming in. That really has a major effect on
Yeah.
on housing prices, like huge.
Right.
Huge, beyond just like the usual supply and demand, because they can afford to like leave them vacant.
Right. I was wondering about that. Like, I don't know. Is that a meaning? I don't know if that's a meaningful effect. Is that a meaningful effect? Like, I hear about these places in New York or whatever that are just nobody's living there because they're basically just an investment.
Yep.
I don't know how many of those there are, and if they really.
Yeah, I
drive
don't know
up
the
price.
stats on it, but I do know that does happen in lots of cities, like in London, Sydney, where I'm from.
Right. And why don't
New
they
York.
choose to also rent them out and make extra money?
They like to be able to use them from time to time.
Oh, okay.
I think sometimes, yeah, some of the super wealthy ones.
Go ahead, Richard.
Those are actually the places like London and New York. Those are actually places where people launder their money so that they can escape taxes. So
Huh.
if they there's like this, I don't know, Reddit that if you get your money and it's past a certain point, it that you can actually, it looks like illegitimate money, and that they, how do I explain it?
So are they buying property as a way of like holding their money, or like in what way are they laundering money?
Like the mob and things like that, the Russian mob. That's what they did in the 1984 with
so they're
Trump properties.
So they're like storing the wealth in the houses, and then somehow, and then getting that out to the to the mafia or something later.
Or maybe
Is that what
you're
you mean?
paying someone for something illegal, and the way you're doing that is by buying a property at a higher price than market price or something like that. Is that
That's
no?
how, yeah, I've heard that happens in the
Paul
art
Manafort.
market.
That's what Paul Manafort. That's how Paul Manafort was
Oh,
laundering
really?
his money, right? Like he had these millions paid to him by the Ukrainians.
Oh
Like, he
yeah.
was-
Okay.
You know, setting up an LLC that's going to buy a condo in Manhattan, and then it's paid for by a wire from Ukraine.
Right.
And I don't know. It's like it's an area where there's a lack of transparency and like transactions, that can
So,
handle millions of
In the
dollars.
art market, I hear they do that too.
Interesting, yeah. So I mean, we're talking about all this shady stuff right now that is kind of like obviously shady if you talk about it. But there's elements of this in stuff that we think of as perfectly normal. Like when people have a house and they think of their house as an investment, then that means part of the reason they bought the house was for these same kinds of reasons, hoping that it's going to increase in value over time. And ideally what you want in terms of access to housing is you want housing to be as cheap as possible. Housing gets cheaper, that screws over anyone who's thinking of their home as an investment or who's using it for that purpose. And,
Right, or who borrowed a ton of money to buy it.
But one of
Or
at least some of
Yeah.
that perception is the feeling that that's one of your few assets you have, and if you and therefore you takes the pressure if you're having a job, particularly the basic income.
right.
Is that kind of where you're going with that?
I actually wasn't going to go that way just now, but I'm really glad that you did.
Yeah,
That's
but-
great. Go ahead, Richard.
And actually, in Germany, they promote renting over buying of homes through their policy, and so that's why it's rather affordable to rent houses there, because if you set your goal to rent rather than buy, then it keeps the home values lower, which means it keeps rents lower as well. While in the U.S., they promote home ownership as the way to go. Or to
It's like a value in itself, right? Like a virtue, and there's like unquestioned virtue.
Right, and there's a pretty significant tax benefit in how,
Right.
because the interest payments are deductible.
Yeah. So let's listen to another segment here.
But why should we listen to greedy developers? They just want to make money.
Well, Sonia's feeling was, okay, so they're greedy, so what?
Well, I don't see what the point is in moralizing something like that. Like, it doesn't seem like it helps the problem. I actually think that's why I went into economics, because economics generally is that one of the values that underlies it is that moralizing about people's behavior isn't super productive.
So I agree with that. And everyone's greedy in the sense that everyone wants to make money. The homeowners who have their house as an investment, they don't want the value of their house to go down. That's, you can frame that as greedy. And, everyone's, the developers are doing what they do because that's how they make money. And I mean, like, you can say that the people who are on the other side are greedy and therefore we shouldn't listen to them. But you can say that about pretty much anyone in a market economy, right?
Right, but I think they were just saying like they couldn't trust the developers to give them like a balanced view of the impact of their development because they have a conflict of interest with being balanced and truthful about it.
Sure, but I think you can't give homeowners a balanced view either. You can't
I agree.
like go to a homeowner and say, it would be really good for the community if the price of your house were half of what it is now. That's really better for
That's
everyone.
kind of what
It's-
Sonia was trying to argue actually.
Yeah.
To me, isn't it more about sort of like making the rules, like like if the rules are such that you get a lot of benefit from pursuing these behaviors, then you're going to get sort of negative outcomes overall.
Oh, but I mean, to make it more concrete, it's like we think we should change the zoning in this neighborhood so that people can build higher or build more units.
Yeah. I also think that people are like, I think it's true that people want to, they want to make money in the sense they want to live. But I think the amount to which people pursue that as an end in itself versus like balancing other parts of what in their life varies from individual to individual. If you build a society around assuming that everybody is like, like this is the only thing they care about and they care about nothing else, then that's the, I feel, to me that's the problem, is that you sort of like you assume that everybody is this kind of like individual profit maximizing agent. That's the only thing that you do. You know, the only thing that drives your behavior is that. Then, and if you build the rules around that, then it sort of, they kind of like, you know, becomes almost a self-fulfilling prophecy. Whereas like if you have a society that's kind of like recognizes different aspects of, you know, human nature that don't necessarily fall into a purely economic paradigm, then you can get something that's not quite as crazy as the system we have now. So I don't know. It's like, to me, it's like, yeah, I mean, I agree with the idea that, you know, it doesn't necessarily, yes, it's sort of, it just not useful to be able to say to people, yeah, like, yeah, you're all greedy, because, you know, stereotype people like that, because it doesn't help them, it doesn't help you move to the next topic of conversation. So to me, it's like, how do you like build I don't know where I'm going with this, but, you know.
Well, it's the difference between, you know, kind of an ad hominem attack, like, I don't like you because of what you represent, and therefore your argument is wrong, versus saying, you know, like, you're saying this, and this is actually going to hurt the community, hurt the economy for these reasons.
These are the consequences of that. Yeah, right. I agree. Yeah, exactly.
One of the things that this is making me think of is like, in terms of who makes the decisions about like zoning for houses and stuff, but it seems like there might be an incentive problem in the sense that if you're making the decision too locally, even if your local people are mostly renters, which is a big if in terms of who's coming to these meetings, and they want the rent to go down, like we've been talking about, they might build a bunch of houses and their local rent doesn't go down because other people just move there. Basically, the decision makers might not be controlling a large enough area so that they can actually address the whole problem, which could be at the level of the city, or even, like we said, at the level of the nation, because otherwise people are just going to move to that city instead of the other city. And so there's like kind of no incentive. There's like a reduced incentive to build the housing locally, because you're just going to have more people move there, and your rent is going to stay the same or go up. And so what you really need is like the right scale. The decision makers have to be at the right scale so that the incentives are aligned.
I think that it's a little bit of a stretch, but a little bit of analogy with the way schools are funded, you know, with property taxes. Because like, you know, like you have an expensive neighborhood gets really good schools, and you want to try and, but a state wants to try and make all the schools better. Well, they don't have really the tools to do that in the same way, because everything is driven by.
Yeah, I think I agree. I think there's an important difference in the sense that at least the local people are empowered to improve their own situation. Yes. Unfortunately, not like the other people's situation. But here, even the local people, like even if they want to bring rents down, because other people can move there, like they can't even do that by building houses.
Yeah, that's true.
Like they can't even control the local situation. I mean, otherwise, I agree in the sense of like where are the decision makers and where's the incentive. Yeah.
Like the libertarian guy at the forum said, he wanted to introduce zoning laws at the federal level, so that all the places were everywhere we see more open zoning laws at the same time, so that more buildings would be reduced.
Yeah, I think what he wanted to do was create a subsidy for cities, where in order to qualify for the cities, you had to do away with all your residential zoning laws or something like that. Yeah. So pay cities to have to upzone basically everything.
Right.
And I think something like that, you know, could make a difference. Whereas, you know, upzoning a particular district in a particular city, maybe not so much.
Yeah, my overall feeling from the podcast was that it's sort of like, you know, like a lot of these tools are like definitely need to be used in terms of construction and to do, you know, demand and stuff, but like really questioning, like, you know, making sure that that you actually are it is actually going to benefit the people you say it's going to benefit, and that it doesn't just become another way for you know, a small number of people to basically monopolize all the returns. And I think that's the challenge. To me, that's always the challenge with these kinds of things, is that, you know, like, yeah, how do you make sure that you don't, you know, what is it? There's that expression, you know, so, privatize the gains and socialize the losses. You know, that kind of like, how do you do that?
Right.
You know, and the YIMBY thing seems a little bit like, it's like they've identified the problem, but their solution is a little too, in my head, too narrow. a tool to what they actually want to achieve, which is like preventing gentrification, say, or at least alleviating the effects of it. So I don't know. That's not the basic income topic, but that was kind of my feeling. I know other people had feelings about that gentrification part of it.
Well, I think the Yimbys were not. I didn't feel like they were saying we're against gentrification. They're just saying we don't want it to be so expensive for us to live.
Right.
Yeah, no, I know. No, I guess what I was saying is I think like their solution would probably, if done in a very sort of like purely market-based way, would probably lead to more gentrification.
I guess the classic economics argument that I'm guessing she has in her head, and it would be just that like kind of like the trickle down thing you were saying, like like everything's going to get less expensive, which means even the lower end housing is going to get less expensive, and it should just hit everybody, you know.
But I think the scale and the time scales and the spatial scales are too like people need relief now. That's going to take too long, and it's too theoretical.
Right.
And it's not just that it's going to take too long. It's that if you have a specific city and you're just doing it in the specific area, you know, the market is more than just that specific area.
Right, I totally agree.
Yeah.
But I guess I find it useful as like a starting point. Like here's the theoretical, like this is what should happen just according to like her view of supply and demand. Now what is she wrong about is like how I was approaching. Like if it's not gonna happen that way, why isn't it gonna happen that way?
Right.
You know, like for example, because other people will move in and so it won't actually decrease or like it won't happen fast enough or
And I think the guy from the Kennedy Forum, Will Wilkinson, his plan of doing it all at once across the entire country, that's a market-based solution, and that's something that I think could work pretty fast and pretty well. And when we talk about gentrification, it kind of includes like a lot of different things, but generally it means, you know, richer people moving into an area at the same time the area is getting more expensive and other people can't afford it and that kind of thing. And it's generally also associated with like improving the quality of infrastructure and, you know, improving the businesses and reducing crime and, you know, like all these other things that make that area more appealing to people who can afford more appealing areas. But if you have that, if all you're doing is you're saying more houses can be built everywhere, then that's a market-based solution, but it's not like an isolated one specific area market-based solution where the market is everywhere and this area is just one tiny segment of it.
Does
that make
raises,
sense?
yeah, it raises another question to me, which is like, we've been talking about how it's almost a natural solution in a way for like more areas to be becoming more desirable places to live. And so
Yeah, that sounds like a good thing.
that seems like a good thing, but then there's this cost where like, you know, we've talked about how people have like social connections and like other roots in a particular place, so it's not necessarily ideal for like this group to like move here and then this group moves here and then this group moves here and then this group moves here.
That's
Like, so how do you make more places more desirable to live and have them be somehow, and have that not be what's
So you don't get the race
I
to the
don't know
bottom
that, yeah,
effect.
You see what I mean?
Yeah.
I don't know. No, I don't see how basic income solves this.
You don't see how basic income solves
No,
this?
so you have to
Well,
walk me
it
through
improves
that.
quality of life everywhere, right?
It does, but I don't see how it solves the bumping each other out of the location problem necessarily. It seems like that would still happen.
Probably not on its own, but maybe it'll alleviate it.
I don't think it hurts it, but I don't think.
Well, you know, I think it gives people the freedom to move away from locations that they already might want to move away from, like what she's talking about. So the first people to get bumped out are the people who already want to be bumped out. And there are
Right.
some people who might have an incentive to stay because they have other stronger ties to the area and stuff.
Right.
And it's not clear to me to what degree they would get bumped out, or even if housing would get cheaper for them because of the people who are leaving, that kind of thing. Like I imagine, so the basic income, it creates more livable land everywhere. So I imagine that except in maybe weird special case scenarios, the housing prices are going to go down everywhere where they're really expensive right now.
Right.
And maybe come up in some areas that are really cheap, but not come up beyond the point where someone with a basic income could afford to live there.
Wait, why not? I guess I feel like that would happen probably.
Because the people who are moving to those areas are doing that because they can afford to live there on a basic income.
Oh yeah, but I don't know.
Largely.
Wouldn't some people, like the same way that gentrification happens now, where it's like oh, like this is like downtown Boston's a little too expensive, right? And
Yeah.
so like Somerville gentrifies, and then like Watertown gentrifies, and then and this is kind of like seems like a natural and to some degree beneficial process. But then the problem is for like the people who already live there not feeling like they want to move.
It's a little bit of a different process because it's the force is coming from the other direction. Instead of so in the process you described, stuff gets too expensive, so that pushes people to other places, and they push people to other places. With basic income, you can imagine we've now created all this land outside, and that pulls people. It pulls people to those places, and then the places they got pulled from get a little bit cheaper, and that pulls people there, et cetera, et cetera. So it's less of a forcing people out, is what I
But
imagine.
why wouldn't the places they're getting pulled to become more expensive? And like, why wouldn't there
Places
be?
they're getting pulled to are going to get more expensive, but those places ultimately are going to be very cheap places.
Wouldn't it happen at every gradient? Why would it only be like the cheapest places?
Yeah, so it's not going to get more expensive at every gradient, because what you're doing is you're allowing people to spread out more. You're giving people more options.
Yeah.
So you'd expect the really expensive areas to get cheaper,
Yeah, I
and then
get
the
that,
really
but-
really cheap areas to get maybe a little bit more expensive. But then there's some area in between where prices just kind of stay the same, where everyone gets a basic income, and that causes more people to move there, but it's not. And that causes prices to raise up to kind of just about where they were before. So the people who were living there before are paying the same prices they were paying before, but now they have a basic income on top of it, so they're a little bit richer, that kind of thing. So that's kind of like the middle ground. But there is a flip. There has to be a flip, right?
It seems like a job for an agent-based model
Yeah, I mean, like
or something.
it's
to really
not. I mean, like I can't say for sure like where that threshold is going to be, but there's got to be a threshold somewhere, because the New York housing market is going to crash under basic income. Like it has to, because people have the freedom to leave now, and the price of things in some rural town, is maybe going to be a little bit higher than it used to be. But
Right.
also, a lot of people are probably going to be moving away from that rural town into more city areas now. So it's not just going to be people in the most concentrated areas move out. It's not just going to be an outward effect. There's also going to be an inward effect from like rural areas where people can now afford to live closer to more infrastructure and that kind of stuff too. So there's kind of like depending on which part of the system you're looking at, different things are going to be happening.
Do you think the medium places are going to get more expensive and the rural places are going to get less? I mean, like your model is getting kind of confusing.
Have people done any research on this yet? This is probably a wide open area, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think someone should do an agent.
Yeah.
Um,
It's something I had some experience doing, so.
Yeah, no, I mean that would be really great if you wanted to like at least put in some like hypothetical numbers and create
Yeah,
a pretty little
yeah.
that would be really really cool.
Nick and I sort of just banter around the idea of like doing something related to that, and
Yeah,
the housing thing might be an interesting place to start. I don't
Yeah.
know, just in my head anyway.
but yeah, I can imagine like the really really rural areas, people are going to leave those areas, and they're going to become slightly more expensive because there's going to be less infrastructure there. Like there is some.
Right, but I really
Yeah.
like the simplicity of your idea of prices evening out, but now you're adding in like various other factors, and I feel like I can do like a really.
I mean, I think the
What the heck is gonna
simplest
happen?
thing is that you'd see prices evening out. Like that's the overall model, the overall picture that we don't want to lose sight of, where people can afford to live in cheaper places. The quality of life improves more in the cheaper places.
Right.
So you see those places getting slightly more expensive, and then you see
Right.
the rich places getting slightly
But
cheaper.
it's kind of like depending on the level of the basic income, there's some like floor beneath which people just like have enough money that nobody wants to live there anymore, and then those places also get cheaper, or like just
Those places would
their
get more
value.
expensive. You'd have to be like really weird if you wanted to like live in Antarctica or something like that, or if you had to like. I don't think basic income is going to kind of stem the tide of like rural communities dying off. It might even
Right.
accelerate it. So then, if you want to live in like a town where you're the only person, stuff is going to get more expensive for you.
Unless you're in an awkward tiny house.
I mean, then
Watching
you're
a lot of
probably
weird tiny
then you're
houses.
maybe not buying the same stuff. Like if you
Right,
still
right.
want to buy all your stuff on Amazon
This is a
and
side note, yeah.
and delivering
Not
to you is
important.
probably expensive. Yeah, I mean like there's a lot of like little individual like quirky edge cases that we can think of, but generally speaking, prices would even out, and yeah.
Interesting.
So I just played this one. Yeah, and I think there's a few different classes of people here. There's renters, and then there's owners.
Right.
And they kind of want different things. And then there's people who are already living in the communities versus people who are looking for somewhere to move or who want to move into a community.
Right.
And they're kind of looking for different things too. Now I think among the renters, the people who are already living in the community want really low rents. And the people who are moving in also want really low rents. So the renters are kind of aligned on what they want, whether they're moving in or whether they're already there, at least with respect to the amount of rent. Now, they might not be aligned on, the renters who already live there might want to see improvements in their community because those improvements are worth it, even though it might raise the rent a little bit or, something like that. But generally speaking, the renters are aligned with each other. Yeah,
there's also, they were talking about the ethnicities, people wanting more of the same ethnicity or the ethnicities to remain the same in an area.
Right, like you've got your community has a certain makeup and it's got a certain culture, and you kind of want to keep that. So this has a little bit to do with people being pushed out, gentrification,
Displacement.
Yeah, displacement.
And the sorting that I think you were mentioning.
Yeah, the big sort.
People really value being around people with similar
like-mindedness.
And there's a ton of efficiency to that. Now you have the various kinds of restaurants and activities and stores and all that stuff that all the people in that geographical area like. I mean, that just makes some degree of sense too. Yeah.
It's funny because I feel like people want certain kinds of diversity in some areas and not so much in others.
Mostly food. I mean, people always want different kinds of food. That's good, but yeah, I mean, even for things like dating, I feel like when people aren't partnered, they're a big drive to live in a place with a lot of people is dating, and you also want to be around people that are already similar enough that it's a good pool. So there's just all
and
these
that might
things
cross racial and
that might cross
boundaries.
That, but maybe not other kinds of things. For a lot of people, maybe it wouldn't cross politics as much, or it wouldn't cross values as much, or whatever it is that people want to assort on. It might not be ethnicity, but it might be something else. Education level, but whatever. But it's just, I feel like it's a. Why am I saying all this? I think what I'm going for here is there's a force that I think is just going to be there in terms of the sorting to some degree. Yeah. People wanting to be around similar people for all these reasons.
Yeah, and I think that sometimes there's a no amount of in economic incentives they might be not as responsive to them as much as you might think because of that. Of those ties,
right. Or the new place would have to have the same kinds of things or something like that. Yeah.
And I think I don't know, sort of very tight-knit communities in the Boston area, people have lived there for generations.
Right.
They're not about to leave. And yeah.
Yeah, that's right. So I guess home ownership kind of somewhat makes that more possible, because some of the ways that people can stay in the same place for generations as rents change, maybe go up, is that they own their house or they pass it down to their child or something like that.
Rent control also
rent
helps with staying in the same place.
For sure. Although I was also thinking about that and how it kind of limits mobility.
It does limit mobility, and it also makes the incentives of the renters who are already there, who are under rent control, no longer aligned with the renters who are looking to move into the area.
Right.
Because the renters looking to move into the area want the market rate to be low, and the rent-controlled renters want their own rent to stay low, which is not the market rate.
Right. Exactly.
So that kind of puts the two classes of renters at odds with each other. If you throw rent control into the mix.
Yeah. Because rent control presumably increases other rents on average.
Yeah. By reducing the quantity of housing that's available at market rate, you're increasing that market rate. And it's the same thing with government subsidized housing or low income housing, that kind of thing. Now you're basically taking units off the market.
Right.
So let's listen to another clip, another segment.
That's great. The Yimbys.
One of them is practical. See, Yimbys complain a lot about neighborhoods making it hard to build things. But Fernando says that's not the main reason there's a shortage of housing. He says the big problem is it's just really, really expensive to build anything in the Central District of San Francisco. It is so expensive. The only kind of housing that developers can figure out how to finance is high-end condos for rich people.
You see, this is what I couldn't understand. This is what
Yeah.
I brought up to you before. I wanted to know more about this because I couldn't figure out what he meant by it being so expensive. Like, is it the kinds of raw materials they have to buy?
No, I think it's,
Probably the zoning,
Yeah.
the cost of the getting the permits. And all
Oh,
that stuff,
I
right?
didn't think
Yeah.
about that. Okay.
I also
Think.
think because the central district is already so built up
Yeah.
Right.
that all you can build are like skyscrapers and stuff like that.
And are those just like really expensive to build?
They're expensive to build.
Yeah, I think they're complicated to build because there's
Right.
so many other buildings around. Then you have to close off the streets, and you have to pay the city for that and that kind of thing.
Right. Interesting. Because he's contrasting it with neighborhoods making it hard. So it seems like it's something else besides like zoning. and stuff.
So he's saying that it's not that the neighborhood regulations are making it hard, it's just by the fact that the central district is already so built up that
And also the land value of the Central District. If all the
Right.
maybe a university there or something like that,
Right.
people were the value of the land would be worth more than say in the outskirts of
Right.
town.
Right, like an empty lot in the middle of the central district of San Francisco is going to cost you a pretty penny,
Yeah.
whereas an empty lot. you know,
Totally. No, I
something
get
like
it. But then wouldn't it still be the case that if they built more, and they built luxury houses or whatever, that would take the rent? Like that would put still a downward pressure on rent in other luxury houses, which was supposedly going to do its little trickle down thing.
Yeah, I mean, then you have to ask. I mean, this is the whole thing. Like the market is not just.
Well,
the
yeah, I
central
mean, but
district
he's
and-
not thinking about that. This guy. So what is he like?
I think he's just. I don't know if he has like a picture of like the global
Yeah.
market and you're just doing this one thing, creating luxury apartments in one place. I don't know if he has a
Right.
vision of that or a concept of that, but I think he is noticing something that's real,
Right.
which is that if you ask a developer what they're building, they're saying, "Oh, we're building luxury apartments," and you ask them why, they're saying, "Well, that's what we can afford. That's
Right.
what's actually."
It's like
gonna be profitable."
it's like the only thing you can.
Right.
There's a sort of it's like a step
Right.
function. You can't just like build like something small scale because the amount of the costumes to build
Yeah.
anything is like so high.
Right.
Right.
I think that's
But
my
isn't- I mean-
interpretation.
Okay, maybe, but maybe it also seems just as likely that it's just because
They can also make more money from that.
right, it's
Right.
what they can make the most money.
Right.
doing.
Wouldn't they? I mean,
Right.
yeah. Wouldn't they be doing that either way if it was what they
Probably
could
both.
make the most money from? Right.
Well, they're always going to be trying to make the most money. Yeah.
Right.
Probably both the factors actually.
So-
Could be. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, the question is, so like, how much more are these luxury apartments going to be? Like, is it the case where or luxury condo? Is it the case where the luxury condo is going to cost, 100 times, the amount that you could get for like a little mini unit, and then our whole like discussion before about like you cram 5 people
I
into
don't
one
think it's
apartment,
just-
you can't cram 100 people.
Hold
into
on,
one
but I don't
apartment.
think it's just
Yeah.
space. I think that this is an important distinction because, like, it's not just about tiny units versus big units. I think it's about the quality of the materials in them and stuff like that.
Oh,
That's,
sure.
That's not really about how much space you're taking up.
Yeah, but I think ultimately it does come down to space. If you're building a bigger unit, and then you might add luxury amenities and stuff like that. But I think that's kind of a second order.
I disagree. I think one of the reasons it can be so much more profitable per unit of really valuable space is that you just put in a nicer sink and such, and then you can charge a lot more without taking up any more space.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's right. I want to hear what Richard has
Yeah.
to say now.
Well, over the past like 70 years, American homes and things have been getting larger. So maybe if you limit the size of each apartment or house, then you can lower the costs overall. But you were talking about how you can put different sinks and things,
Well,
or have mahogany floors or
I
whatever.
heard that's kind of like stopping now. It's kind of like the trend is kind of peaked and it's like going the other way now. Like
in terms of
the
the
houses are not
yeah.
like the McMansion phenomena is kind of like slowed down a lot more, especially since
Yeah.
but maybe it's somewhat self-limiting now
Mm.
Yeah.
because it's so expensive. You
Right.
can't build these houses.
Yeah. But I think Bethany's right that, you know, once you are building a luxury apartment, you know you're going to want to be the reason you're building a luxury apartment is because you know it's more profitable to have a bigger apartment that has all these amenities than it is to divide it into 2 smaller apartments or 5 smaller apartments or something like that.
But I'm also trying to say, like, it could be the same size apartment. I see this in Boston. Like, there are apartments that are the same size as our apartment and are 3 times as much because they have different, like, they're more modernized and renovated. So you're also
Well,
getting money in that way.
Any new development is going to be modern, right?
But they talked
So
about
there's-
it in this podcast, I think.
there's-
Yeah, they do fancify them though. That's what you mean.
Yeah,
like they,
exactly.
Like,
And
put granite
so-
countertops.
And
So-
so part of
so
what they're
you're-
talking
You're
about.
comparing our apartment to a newly constructed apartment.
Well, all I'm trying to say is, like, I think part of what makes it so much more profitable to make luxury apartments is that you're not even renting fewer of them. You maybe even be renting the same number, and they're way more expensive because you put in nicer materials and stuff, and now people are willing to pay.
But I think
more.
what allows
Yeah.
that
Right,
is that there's like a lot of pent up demand,
right, exactly. Yeah,
Right.
I agree.
and so it wouldn't be profitable. It seems like you have to build a whole bunch of luxury units,
Right,
and sort of exhaust that demand.
exactly. Yeah,
And then you
Before
can
you're going to start
Right.
getting the
exactly.
yeah.
Yeah, that's
Before
right.
it
I
becomes
totally
ec-
agree. And that
it's
comes back
economical
to
to make.
Alex's point, even about like the international market and like how do you exhaust that demand in
right,
one
and
city?
it's probably
Yeah.
inexhaustible.
And- and
at
there's-
least we're taking a lot to exhaust.
Yeah, I mean, there's rich people who are willing to pay more for the luxury stuff, and the degree to which they're willing to pay more for an apartment exceeds the cost of installing these various amenities and stuff like that. So you want to do that. Now they're not building like luxury shipping container size apartments. They are building, you know, bigger apartments because that's what these people are going to pay for. And you know, I think my point is still valid. They're not going to divide it into like a really small New York tenement, you know, size apartment.
Yeah, but that's sort of, I guess that's sort of a separate point than what I was. That's also true, but like you also get a bump up from like adding. Well, like and I think it's really what Nick said. I think there's
Yeah.
like this pent up demand that you're able to tap into.
It's funny
Yeah.
because
I think
even
that's right.
even where in Arlington where I live, like everything new has got luxury on it. Everything like there's
Well,
nothing.
yeah,
There's
I mean,
no. There's
right.
no, I haven't ever seen a development. You know, there's this house in the corner which is it was an old house and it's like they're stripping and everything and they're putting luxury, but it's not really like they're not like building a whole new building that's completely fresh. It's like they're basically
Right.
gutting it and turning it, and it's like you
Well,
go.
there's an advertising issue there too,
Yeah,
right?
that's
Like
marketing.
fancy ketchup. Like I
Yeah.
don't know, right? Like is it really luxury or not? Like they have no incentive not to say.
Yeah, say
luxury, right?
It's
Yeah.
puffery. I have to laugh
Puffery,
though.
which
You
is
know,
okay.
it's funny. It's like a laugh.
Another thing though, like one side point, one thing that is a little bit strange about economics that might play into some of these houses is like there's also the costly signaling motive where like people are willing to spend money to show
Right.
that they can spend money, and you don't necessarily have to give them like a bigger apartment or anything of functional value to do that. Like you just give them
Call it
a
that.
diamond, studded toilet or whatever, and like because people have the function of trying to show that they can spend the money. So there's probably some of that
Yeah,
in these
that's
apartments
true.
too.
I think part of what you're paying for with the luxury amenities is that. I would
Right,
say that's part of that
exactly, yeah.
category.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's what I'm saying. And that doesn't cost any space for the developers, and maybe it doesn't even cost that much, relative to what people are willing to pay for it. I don't know.
Right.
If what your function is in spending a lot on an apartment is to show that you can spend a lot on an apartment, that's a really good deal for the apartment maker. So whenever there's costly signaling in there, it's going to be like way more profitable for them.
Yeah, I mean that's part of the amenities that they would add. I would say that the most like when you're talking about a luxury anything, usually the stuff that makes it luxury is an excuse to charge way more
Than you would normally.
than what it actually costs to put that luxury thing in. So a luxury car, it doesn't really use that many more materials or technology than a regular car. But you add these like little niceties and bells and whistles, and you can charge a lot more for
So
it.
you're defining it luxury by costly signaling, basically, because that's how I would talk about that. Otherwise, I would say, why are people willing to pay so much for it?
I would say there's a costly signaling component to luxury. I would say that that's part of it. It's why you're willing to pay disproportionately more.
Right.
Yeah.
Because otherwise, you shouldn't be willing to pay disproportionately more. You should just be willing to pay as much as you enjoy the little bells and whistles, or else you just buy the other car.
I would say the costly signaling is one of the bells and whistles you're paying for. Yeah.
Like, it's the thing that drives up the price more than the cost of putting those bells and whistles in and stuff.
Yeah, it's not cost based. It's and you know, part of it is like if you are just really super rich, you're not thinking about price, which also is another signal to people. I'm not even thinking about price. I just want all of these things, right? Yeah. So that allows luxury car makers to charge kind of whatever they want. Yeah. And similar for the apartment as well.
Like your Bentleys or your Rolls Royces.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Well, it's just like a very specific difference in how people in consumer behavior, where it's like if you're buying something to show off that you can spend a lot of money, you're not sensitive to price in the same way.
Yeah.
Like you're not going to want it to be cheap in the same way that you do with most things.
Don't want it. The whole point.
Right,
is it's
exactly.
not
You
cheap.
don't want it to be cheap. So
Right.
economics work in very different ways. Yeah.
So yeah, I mean, there's always a component of that when you're talking about luxury.
Right.
I agree, and I think clearly the fact that that developers are building luxury apartments, and I think part of what they're recognizing is that the market rate for this housing is so high that they can afford to add these luxury amenities. Like, it doesn't really make that much of a difference for the developer, but it does, allow them to compete on dimensions other than price with the other apartments in the area, and they can charge a little bit more and that kind of thing.
Right.
Yeah.
And I guess this kind of goes back to Nick's point that there's just like a really high demand. Like there's just a lot of unsaturated demand. Yeah. At that level.
Yep.
One of the things that I've thought about a little bit in relation to rent and housing, I guess, is and I think I almost don't bring it up because I think it's like this stuff is complicated enough without adding this in. But if we're imagining a like a bootstrapped basic income, like Circles or Gresham, and I mean, it kind of doesn't matter if you think it's going to sort of just grow explosively and effectively take over all at once. But if it has to go through a period of more gradual growth, like how does that change? How does that change these questions? Like how or I mean, I guess the question that I found myself thinking about a little while ago, more in relation to Circles, I guess, is is it different? Are housing costs or rent? Is there anything special about it to think through in terms of, is it especially valuable? Is it better or worse than other things to try to include in the
building of the
Price
system.
index?
No, in the like flows of money that are flowing in these other currencies.
But there's some like feedback loops from like when you create a currency like this that you might then
Like,
affect
should you
the
not waste
housing
your
market.
time trying to figure out if there's a way that people can pay rent or part of their rent using their Circles
their
currency?
basic income.
Right.
Uh,
One thing that I think,
Yeah,
go ahead. One thing that comes to mind is that, like, in a way, if they're using their basic income, their Gresham to buy their groceries, then there's like they have more money to pay for rent.
Right.
Right. So it's like kind of like it's going to that anyway because they're using it for other things. They don't have to use that money for that, so that money becomes more available for rent.
Right. I mean, that's the sort of argument where like doesn't matter
Right.
right.
where people have a chance to spend it.
Yeah, and I would say anywhere they can spend it is good and adds more flexibility. So if they can use it to pay rent, then
That's good.
now they have more money left over to buy groceries as
Yeah.
well, and that's fine too.
And
if like they don't have any other sources of income, then it becomes more important because like rent is pretty important as an expense.
Yep.
So
But
that's where it would make the most difference.
But also, if your only income is the basic income, but then other people have the basic income and they're spending more dollars, then maybe there's more dollars you can compete for and get some regular money elsewhere. I don't know. This is all. I don't know.
I think Bethany hit on, for me, maybe the thing that it all hinges on, which is how important is it for the scheme, or in the motivation for it or the vision that's compelling to people. Is it that there are some people who are really going to rely on it a lot, or are able to rely on it a lot?
Right.
I mean, for me, the story that's compelling in relation to that is, it's I like the idea that this would enable, passionate activists to, for there to be more people who are devoted to, as long as it's the causes I think are
Right.
Better check on that before you give them the basic.
who are living very frugally because it allows them to
Right.
devote their energy to
And the more people you have doing that, maybe the more you'll be able to change some other structural elements as well, right?
Right. And if we're that's why it's important to me. If and because I live in a place where cost of living is high, and in my fantasy it's happening near me, then it seems kind of important, because housing cost is such a big chunk of
Right.
someone's budget.
It seems to have gone. I think I don't know the stats I've looked at, but I think it has gone up as a fraction of people's average income quite substantially in the last 20 years, right? I mean, it used to be like
right, especially in these.
it used to be like I think they say like it should be 28% of your like no more, but now it's like more like 35 or something percent. Like all upwards. Or for many people, half their income goes towards rent or mortgage.
Yeah. So when I think of basic income, I tend to think of it as money that can be spent on anything. Now, obviously, some of these systems, like
certainly ideally, but we're talking about like a transition,
including the one I'm working on, which is Gresham. It's not going to be like that initially, and I think when I think about Gresham, I don't think about it being in this state for very long, where you can't spend it on very many things.
Right.
I think if you can only spend it in a very restricted way for any considerable period of time, then the system's probably going to end up failing.
Right.
Yeah. I don't know if you could have a sustainable kind of complementary currency basic income that is, pegged to the dollar, where it doesn't get more adoption and reach a kind of critical mass where people are using this currency. Yeah, I don't know. I think there's a lot to talk about here. Kind of tangential to basic income and the housing market.
Yeah.
But I do think your point that basic income doesn't. There's a lot of problems basic income doesn't solve. But if people have basic income, then that can give them the freedom to work more on solving some of these other problems. Like
that to me is one of the key things that makes it attractive. Is that it creates structures for other things to happen. I mean, it solves the problem too, but it has these other effects.
Right. And we can, there's certainly arguments to be had about how to make a basic income happen, and that's more to your question, like the logistics of that and how to make it happen. But in an ideal world, the government would just wake up and say, "Oh yeah, all right, we should pay everyone basic income." That's the best way to make it happen. But there's other ways to kind of try to fudge it that I'm working on and other people are working on. Any final thoughts on the housing market? Why don't we go around real quick if you have a final thought?
I think I'm still with this question of how much would happen organically in terms of other really desirable places springing up. including under it as a basic income, and how much it would be helpful to have centralized intervention, like we're talking about, building little seeds of infrastructure,
Yeah.
or if that already exists enough, or just those
Yeah.
kinds of questions are still bopping around in my mind.
Yeah, this discussion I think really sort of changed my view on some things. I think I was, I started out pretty sympathetic to the idea that, build more units. And I don't think it's not like I think that's bad now, but I see more of the complexity. I think, and I don't know. I want to think more about this question. This question of like, how much would it really even out? And I guess for me, it's partly because I feel like basic income increases people's freedom. Like it's enabling people to do what they already want to do, maybe. And we have the situation with a lot of pent up demand, right? Like people want to move to these places already. I'm a little worried that more people are going to be enabled to like go for that. I'm not feeling really confident that it's going to
help take some of the pressure off.
That's going to take the pressure off.
Okay, Alex.
Yeah, I'd say that the solving the housing, I call it the housing situation, not just housing market, because I think to me it's like we talk about housing market as if that's all about housing. It's like there's other things we've got to think about that, and I think it's really complicated, and basic income could have all the good effects that we discussed, but I think there's some other things about how policy of how we structure ownership, how we tax incentives that we're going to have to really dig into. This is not to sort of say that basic income couldn't help, but I think it's not going to help as much as it could in other areas like jobs and things like that. I feel like because it's such a chunk of the economy and there's so much ossification around the existing system, that basic income is probably only going to chip at the edges of that problem. And I think there's a lot of other things in terms of the way we build houses and the way we the whole housing market as a market is going to change. So I'm a little less sanguine about basic income's ability to make a huge dent in that, because it's become such a big part of wealth creation in the United States and other countries. So that's where I I don't know enough about it to really have a really good answer, but I feel like that's the real problem. It's one of the more intractable problems, I think.
Okay, Richard.
Over the next 30 years or so, megacities are going to, populations over 20 million or so are going to start expanding, and the countryside is going to start dissipating or clearing out. And so housing is going to become a greater and greater problem unless we find some ways to solve it. And basic income could be a means to alleviating some of the pressure, but it's not the only answer, and we do not know all the effects it could have on the market. So the job market or the housing market or the services of healthcare and whatnot. But it's inevitable with the way that things are going with automation and whatnot.
Okay. Well, I'm just going to go out and say that I am very confident and very sanguine in basic income completely solving the housing crisis. I think there are many complexities to this problem, and I think basic income kind of gets around all of them by creating more livable space in the world. And that's it. We went a little bit over. Thanks, guys, for sticking around. We don't have one next week, the Wednesday before Thanksgiving, but then in 2 weeks, we're going to be talking about
Oh, yeah.
modern monetary theory, which is this popular economic trend that people often accuse me of subscribing to. So it's going to be Howlett monetary theory versus modern monetary theory. So I'll see you guys in 2 weeks for that.
That'd be a good one.
So that's it.
Thank you. There's a couple of more questions from your mom there.